Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second Amendment. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the Model 1863 Springfield rifled musket. It was a pretty typical rifled musket that saw heavy use during the American Civil War in the mid and later parts, in particular with the Union Army, though some did end up in Confederate hands. Now, just to clear up any misunderstandings, this is not an 1863 Springfield. I wasn't able to get my hands on one. They are surprisingly hard to find in Washington. But this is an 1863 Zouave. It's essentially just a shortened version of the 1863 Springfield. Shorter barrel, but the exact same action, basically the same bore. And they're much easier to come across, which is why I have one. 1863 Zouave did not see service in the American Civil War. This was a post-war design based on various skirmishing rifles that did see service during the war. Now, in wartime, during the war, you would often not see round balls like this, like you typically associate with muskets. Instead, just set this down, instead it would typically be a Minié ball. The Minié ball was actually it looks a bit like a modern pistol bullet. Very fat and long sort of design. But it was actually not done for accuracy, even though it was used in the rifled muskets, which were used specifically for their accuracy over smoothbores. Rather, the Minié ball was a way of making them easier to ram down, because in order to properly engage the rifling, a round ball would have to be fitted very tightly to the barrel, using a patch typically, or wadding, which had a number of issues. One, it made it very difficult to ram down. Essentially, picture like trying to turn a screw by hand, or trying to turn a screw by pushing down on it. You can do it theoretically, but it's going to be really difficult. But the Minié ball was fluted on the back end, so it allowed air to escape up the sides, so it let the ball still slip down like it should much more easily. It was not easy to ram down, but it was a hell of a lot easier than doing it with a round ball. In fact, if you see anyone who shoots a rifled musket today with round balls, they'll often have a bullet starter and their ramrod as two separate items. The bullet starter is typically a T-handle that you push down, specifically because it is much harder to ram down a round ball. I'm sure plenty of you have questions as to why rifled muskets weren't used more commonly if they were already being used by the Napoleonic Wars. Why weren't they used earlier? Well, even if they had them. Quite simply, it's a matter of cost primarily. There are examples of rifled muskets going all the way back to the 1400s or even the 1500s or even 1400s, but they were too expensive for any army to adopt en masse. And so they pretty much were just limited to hunting rifles and that sort of thing. I think King Louis even had a few that were magazine-fed. Very interesting designs. Forgotten Weapons has a very interesting video on that, though I'd love to get my hands on one of them if I could. Unfortunately, there's only a couple of those types of weapons in existence, so not holding my breath on that. And actually, on the point of smoothbore versus rifled, another massive advantage with using a rifled musket as opposed to a smoothbore for warfare was massively increased engagement distances. So, for example, during the American Civil War or during the Crimean War as well, armies with rifled muskets would typically be able to engage at somewhere around 400 to 500 yards out, where a smoothbore, well, a good shooter could hit a human-sized target, even a decent shooter could hit a human-sized target at about 100 yards, where a very experienced shooter, for example, a British light infantryman, they were trained in marksmanship very deliberately and very well, they could probably hit a man at 200 yards. But for an average soldier to hit at 400 or 500 yards is incredible. Anyone who's ever shot that far knows just how tiny a target is, and they were doing it with iron sights as well. Whereas in musket warfare, typically 100 to 200 yards was the typical engagement range. So obviously being able to more than double your effective range was a massive benefit. Obviously, all of warfare has been focused on hitting the enemy without them being able to hit you. That's why spears were really popular, and then bows, and then eventually guns. There are 5 types of, broadly speaking, of locks for black powder firearms that you will find. There are wheel lock and match lock, which were used largely interchangeably in the early days of firearms when they were still trying to figure out what was the best way to ignite the powder. They each have their own advantages and disadvantages. Match lock, pretty self-explanatory. A fuse burns down, ignites the powder, and that sends the ball out. That was probably the earliest example of a firearm design. If you look at something like the Chinese fire lance, it's essentially a matchlock design. Then there's wheel lock, which is sort of the beginning of the concept that became flintlocks. You use it essentially as a coiled spring, which a hammer on a coiled spring which strikes a pan, and the movement creates sparks which ignite the powder. Then you've got dog locks, which are basically the same as a flintlock, just an earlier iteration of the same concept. Then you've got the flintlocks most people are familiar with, where the hammer sends a flint forward, which strikes against a flat piece of metal, creating sparks which hit the powder in the pan and ignites the powder in the barrel. Then you've got the last type of muzzleloader action, which is the cap lock. Essentially, you take a cap like this. Don't think you can see that very well from that perspective, but that's the cap. This is muskets use their own sorts of caps. There's also pistol caps and modern rifle caps. Number 10 and number 11 specifically are their sizes. But yeah, you slip the cap over top of what's called the nipple here. I'm just doing that because this one's a little bit out of line, so to get it actually fit on, I have to do that. Now, when you pull the hammer, or the cock as the historically accurate term is, back, this is supposed to lock, which, again, this one's not in the best shape, it doesn't lock back. When you pull the trigger, the hammer goes forward, ignites a small explosive compound in the cap, which sends a jet of fire through this touch hole here into the barrel, where it ignites the powder and sends the ball down the barrel. Now, this being called the cock originally is where the term cocking a gun comes from pulling back the cock. It's cock as in rooster, not as in the modern meaning of the term, of the word. But, and if you're looking at this design and you're wondering, well, how do you see something like that? You think, how do you walk with this weapon and have a cap on there? Well, quite simply, typically you would have the weapon unloaded while you're marching, but if you needed to, for example, run cover to cover, or even if you loaded and then your commanding officer ordered you to load, and then changed his mind and you decided to move, but you didn't want to waste a cap, the cock on these is actually, or the hammer, is perfectly sized so that it slips over top of the cap and holds it in place. And then when you actually get to where you need to be, pull it back and fire. Well, our modern firearms. For example, it was the first en masse use of rifled muskets. They'd been used a bit in the Crimean War a few years earlier, but that was very small level, and typically the Russians didn't have many rifled muskets of their own. It was mainly just the French and British using rifled muskets. The Russians did have rifled muskets, but they mostly sent them to Poland rather than Turkey because the French were going to try and invade through Poland, which maybe they would have if the Russians had not shored it up, but that's all hypothetical history, and we'll leave that to guys like maybe Potential History can do a video on that. Or Forgotten Weapons, perhaps. And rifling, of course, is standard in basically any gun you find today. There are still a few examples of smoothbore. For example, in Russia, there's a legal loophole intended to let people keep old smoothbore muskets that are, for example, family heirlooms, but smoothbore weapons are not considered firearms by Russian law, so you can basically buy them off, well, however you like. So Kalashnikov does make a few smoothbore semi-automatics to get around the law. I've heard they're pretty good weapons. They mostly make them in 3.66 TKM, since most of the people in Russia who want firearms in the first place are hunters rather than civilians. Civilians can still get them perfectly easily, but that's where the money is, so that's where they went. Generally, everything else that you find today is going to be a rifled weapon. Even like, let's say a tiny subcompact like a Zip 22, for example. That's actually, I don't know about the Zip 22. I've never gotten my hands on one, but that is probably a rifled weapon. It would be, and again, it wouldn't need to be, but that's precisely the point. By seeing just how effective en-masse rifled musketry was, it led to the advancement of things like the, for example, the German Schnellgewehr, or more specifically the Dreiss needle gun. Also to later French designs like the Chassepot, or and then later the 1886 Lebel. That's what all sparked that. The American Civil War as a whole was a massive step forward for firearms innovation, and similarly our availability to firearms as civilians, because, well, gun designers it was a time where there were so many new ideas, and finally there was an opportunity for gun designers to put them into effect. For example, we saw the first striker-fired weapons. So think like a Glock is a very common example of a striker-fired weapon. And we started to see the earliest examples of those in the American Civil War. We also saw revolvers first appearing in combat. Black powder revolvers are actually one of my favorite types of weapons. Unfortunately, they didn't see very much use in combat, despite being very good for their time, because by the time anyone knew how good they were, we were getting into the 1870s, 1880s, so we were starting to see, like into the 1880s, where we were starting to see smokeless powder becoming a thing, and we got, for example, the Webley revolver. That was, basically a far better design than the cartridge black powder thing that you saw in the American Civil War. Yeah, so this has been History of the Second Amendment. And I was looking today at the 1863 Springfield. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.